the tier in reality opened above the Atacama Desert at 3:14 in the morning, a wound of black and violet light, stretching 2 kilometers across the night sky, and for 6 minutes, nothing came through it at all. Then, at 3:20, the first of the choir descended. They called themselves the Choir of Unmaking, though humanity would never learn this name in time for it to matter. They were not aliens in any sense, human science understood, not creatures of flesh and blood evolved on some distant world, but something older and stranger, euros, entities that had existed for longer than stars had burned, feeding on fear, on suffering, on the slow unraveling of sentient minds across 10,000 consumed worlds. Worlds that had once had names, cultures, histories, all of it devoured and forgotten, their populations reduced to husks long before the choir moved on to the next unfortunate reality that crossed their path. Their scouts, 7-limbed things, wreathed in shifting darkness that human eyes physically could not focus on for more than a few seconds without inducing seizures, spread out, from the tier, within the hour, moving toward the nearest population centers with a patient, unhurried malice. They had done this 10,000 times before. They knew, with absolute certainty born of 10,000 successful harvests, exactly how a civilization broke. First came the terror. Then came the despair. Then, inevitably, came the harvest. What the choir did not know, euros, could not have known, because nothing in 10,000 consumed worlds had prepared them for it, euros. Was that Earth's governments had spent the better part of a century quietly re-preparing for exactly this scenario. Ever since a joint intelligence assessment in 1947 concluded that humanity's greatest threat might not be extraterrestrial at all, but extra-dimensional. Colonel Elena Vasquez received the call at 3:41 in the morning, 17 minutes after the tier opened, in a secure facility beneath the Colorado Rockies that had existed, in various forms, since the Truman administration. Confirmed dimensional breach, Atacama Desert coordinates, the voice on the line said. Scale classification, Omega, repeat, Omega classification confirmed by 3 independent monitoring stations. Vasquez had spent 19 years training for a call she had never truly expected to receive. Omega classification meant something had come through that fell entirely outside conventional threat assessment, euros. Not a hostile nation, not even a hostile alien civilization, but something the Cold War-era architects of Task Force Sable had feared above all else, an incursion from beyond the boundaries of ordinary physical reality. Wake the Reapers, she said. All 8 teams. Full deployment authorization, effective immediately. The world would come to know them, eventually, in the fragmented, terrified reports that leaked out in the weeks that followed, as Special Forces, euros, a deliberately vague, deliberately reassuring term that gave no hint of what those forces actually were, or what 6 decades of preparation had transformed them into. The Choir of Unmaking, arriving with 10,000 years of unbroken conquest behind them, would come to know them by a different name entirely, in the brief, horrified moments before their own extinction. They would come to know them as the thing that finally made a choir afraid. Task Force Sable had begun, in the aftermath of the Roswell incident, and several subsequent far more classified encounters, as a modest research initiative studying recovered fragments of technology and biology that defied conventional physics entirely. Within a decade, following an incursion in 1958 that had cost the lives of an entire Nevada research station before being contained, its mission had expanded into something far more ambitious and far darker. Understanding not just what might come through from beyond ordinary reality, but how to fight it when it did. The soldiers of what would eventually be designated the Reaper program were not, in any meaningful sense, ordinary special forces. They were volunteers, drawn from the most elite units of a dozen allied nations, who underwent a transformation process that remained so classified that even most of Task Force Sable's own command staff knew only fragments of what it involved, euros. A combination of experimental genetic modification, technology recovered from at least 3 prior extra-dimensional incursions, and psychological conditioning designed to allow a human mind to withstand direct exposure to entities whose very presence was engineered, across 10,000 harvested worlds, to shatter sanity on contact. Where the choir's scouts induced terror, Simply by existing within a victim's field of vision, the Reapers had been conditioned, through decades of exposure therapy using contained fragments of extra-dimensional material, to look directly at horror without breaking. Where the Choir's physiology existed, partially outside normal spacetime, making them nearly untouchable by conventional weapons, the Reapers carried modified equipmenta Euros, developed from recovered alien technology Euros, specifically calibrated to strike targets that existed in that liminal, shifting state. They had trained for 60 years for a war that, until 3:14 that morning, had existed only as theoretical worst-case scenario. Now it was real, and 8 teams of the most dangerous soldiers humanity had ever produced were about to discover exactly how prepared they truly were. Captain Marcus Webb led Reaper Team 1 into the Atacama Desert, 40 minutes after the breach, moving through terrain that had already begun to change in ways his sensors struggled to quantify. Euro temperature fluctuations that made no meteorological sense, patches of ground where sound simply refused to travel, a wrongness in the air that even his conditioning couldn't entirely suppress. Contact, reported Sergeant Aisha Okonkwo, first to spot one of the Choir's scouts moving through the darkness ahead. Multiple contacts. There, Captain, they're not moving like anything organic should move. Webb had seen the classified eye briefing footage of the 1958 incursion. Had studied every recovered fragment of data from 3 prior contained breaches, and still felt something cold settle in his stomach at his first direct sight of the Swire's scouts. Euros, 7-limbed silhouettes that seemed to bend the darkness around them. Their movements carrying a horrible, patient fluidity that no evolved creature should possess. Standard doctrine, Webb said, forcing steadiness into his voice. Resonance weapons full spread. Don't look directly at the central mass, focus your peripheral vision. We've trained for this. They had trained for this. It did not make the reality of it any less horrifying. The resonance rifles, carried by Reaper Team 1, fired not conventional projectiles but focused bursts of dimensionally attuned energy, technology reverse-engineered from a Choir-adjacent entity recovered during the 1958 Incursion a Euros. A weapon designed specifically to force an extra-dimensional target briefly, violently, into full physical alignment with normal space-time, where conventional destruction became possible. The first scout, struck by concentrated fire from 6 resonance rifles simultaneously, let out a sound that no human throat could have produced. And no human ear could fully process, a shriek that seemed to come from several directions and several moments in time all at once. Then it collapsed, fully solid for the first time since crossing into Earth's reality, and Webb's team finished it with conventional rounds, before it could reassert its liminal state. It was the first time in 10,000 years of conquest that a member of the Choir of Unmaking had been killed by anything a harvested world had produced. It would not be the last. Word of the encounter reached the Choir's Central Intelligence Euros, a vast, ancient consciousness that coordinated the Choir's harvest from somewhere beyond the tear itself. Euros. Within the hour, and for the first time in its incomprehensibly long existence, that consciousness held something it had not experienced since the earliest days of its own unknowable origin. Uncertainty. 10,000 worlds had fallen to the Choir's harvest through a single, unbroken strategy. Overwhelming psychological terror, deployed patiently and precisely until a civilization's will to resist simply dissolved, followed by a harvest that left nothing behind but empty husks and silence. Not once, in 10,000 successful campaigns, had a single scout been destroyed by the inhabitants of a target world. The Choir's very existence, partially outside normal physical law, had made them functionally invulnerable to anything a merely physical species could produce. The Central Intelligence deployed a second wave, larger and more aggressive than the first. Euros, not scouts this time, but Reapers of the Choir's own hierarchy, entities whose mere presence had, on 10,000 prior worlds, been sufficient to induce mass psychological collapse across entire cities before a single physical confrontation ever took place. It did not understand, could not understand, that the soldiers waiting for that second wave had spent 6 decades specifically conditioning themselves against exactly that kind of psychological assault, using controlled exposure to fragments of the very same horror the Choir now unleashed at full force. The battle that followed, in the hours before dawn, would remain among the most closely guarded secrets in modern military history. 8 teams of Reaper operators, supported by conventional military forces, holding a security perimeter that stretched for kilometers around the breach site, engaging in running combat against an enemy whose true nature the vast majority of even the supporting soldiers were never permitted to fully understand. Colonel Vasquez coordinated the engagement from a mobile command post 6 kilometers from the tier, watching reports come in from all 8 teams simultaneously, each one a testament to 60 years of preparation meeting a threat that had, until that night, existed only in the darkest theoretical assessments of Task Force Sable's founding scientists. Team 3 reports heavy contact, requesting resonance charge resupply. Came one transmission. Team 6 confirms 2 Choir Reapers destroyed, moving to secondary position. The operator's voice tight, with an exhaustion that went far beyond the physical. By 5:30 in the morning, as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the eastern horizon, the choir's central intelligence made a decision that, in 10,000 years of unbroken conquest, it had never once been forced to consider withdrawal. It could not comprehend how a Tier 1 physical species one it had assessed, in the moments before the tier opened, as utterly unprepared for extra-dimensional contactoros, had produced soldiers capable of not merely resisting the choir's terror, but hunting its reapers with a cold, methodical efficiency that felt, to an entity that had spent 10 millennia as an apex predator, disturbingly familiar. The tier began to close at 5:47 in the morning, the choir's surviving forces retreating back through the collapsing breach, in a manner that Task Force Sable's psychologists would later describe, in careful, clinical language, as consistent with genuine fear, an emotion the choir had inflicted upon 10,000 worlds, but had never, in all its unknowable existence, been forced to experience itself. By the time the tier closed completely at 6:03 in the morning, the Atacama Desert had returned to its ordinary, silent emptiness, its sands scattered with the evidence of a battle that official government reports would attribute, in the days that followed, to a classified military exercise involving experimental aircraft. Colonel Vasquez stood at the edge of the site where the breach had opened, watching the sun rise over a desert that, 6 hours earlier, had briefly become the front line of a war most of humanity would never know it had survived. "Casualties?" she asked Captain Webb, who stood beside her, his uniform torn, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had looked directly at something no human being should have to see. 3 wounded, Colonel. No fatalities." Webb paused, watching the empty sky where the tier had been. "They didn't expect us to fight back. Not really fight back, not the way we did. 60 years of preparation," Vasquez said quietly. 60 years of hoping we'd never need it. And being terrified of what would happen if we did. Do you think they'll come back?" Vasquez considered the question for a long moment. Watching the desert wind scatter sand across ground that, hours earlier, had briefly hosted a horror 10,000 years in the making. "I think," she said finally, "that whatever they are, they've spent 10,000 years learning exactly one lesson about every world they've ever touched. That fear always wins in the end. Tonight, for the first time, they learned something new." "What's that?" "That some species don't break," Vasquez said. "They just get ready, and you never want to be the one who finds out what they've been getting ready for." Task Force Sable's official report on the incident, filed under a classification level that placed it beyond the reach of even most senior government officials, would end with a single recommendation, one that Colonel Vasquez insisted be included, word for word: "The entities encountered during the Atacama incursion possess capabilities and a historical record of conquest that should, by every rational measure, have made this world's defense impossible. That it did not become impossible is a testament not to our technology, though that technology proved decisive, but to 60 years of preparation for a threat we hoped, every single day, we would never have to face. We were ready, we must remain ready. Because whatever the choir of unmaking has told the rest of whatever lies beyond that tier, one truth now exists that did not exist 12 hours ago. Earth is no longer an easy harvest. And somewhere out there, in the dark between all the realities that surround our own, Something that has never known fear is finally learning what it feels like.